In 15 years investigating domestic crimes, I've never seen anything like Sarah Mitchell. This respected teacher endured 22 years of abuse from husband William. When she asked for one weekend trip with colleagues, his violent response broke her. That Monday, she sedated him, suffocated him with a plastic bag, and stored his body in their basement freezer. Then she went on the trip and played the worried wife when he disappeared. But here's what still haunts me. How do you live normally for days knowing your husband's corpse is in the same freezer where you keep your food? Subscribe to the channel, because cases like Sarah's reveal the hidden warning signs of domestic abuse that could save someone's life before it's too late. There are cases that stay with you long after the files are closed. Cases that make even seasoned investigators pause and wonder how much darkness one person can endure before something inside them finally breaks. The Sarah Mitchell case is one of those stories. 22 years of marriage that looked perfectly normal from the outside, but behind closed doors harbored secrets that would eventually lead to a freezer in a modest Chicago home, containing something that would shock an entire city. Sarah Mitchell and William Parker had been together for over 2 decades when neighbors knew them as just another middle-aged couple trying to make it through life. Nobody suspected that beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary relationship lay a foundation built on control, fear, and years of accumulated trauma that had been festering like an untreated wound. But trauma has a way of finding its release, and on November 13th, 2022, Sarah Mitchell reached a breaking point that would change everything. What happened that night would send shockwaves through their quiet neighborhood. But to understand how a 40-year-old woman could end up storing her husband's body in their home freezer, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand who Sarah Mitchell was before she became the woman who would sit across from Detective Reynolds in that cramped interview room, her hands shaking as she prepared to confess to something that had been eating away at her for days. The story begins not with the crime itself, but with a little girl who never knew what it meant to feel safe. Sarah's mother was barely 16 when she gave birth to her, a teenager who had no idea how to raise a child and even less interest in learning. Within a year there was another baby, and by 17, Sarah's mother had made a choice that would define her daughter's entire childhood. She walked away from motherhood and into a life that most people only whisper about in small towns. Sarah's older sister disappeared into the foster system, adopted by relatives who lived states away. Sarah herself was passed around like an unwanted burden, first living in a house where the children of working women were kept, a place that smelled of old cigarettes and broken dreams. She was maybe 4 or 5 years old when she was moved again, this time to live with an elderly woman who took in children for the small amounts of money their absent parents could occasionally scrape together. Mrs. Henderson was her name, an aging woman whose mind wasn't quite as sharp as it once was, and whose ability to care for a growing child was questionable at best. Sarah's mother would visit sporadically, sometimes disappearing for months at a time, leaving behind promises she never kept, and a little girl who learned early that love was something other people had, not something she could count on. By the time Sarah was 7 years old, she had never set foot in a classroom. While other children her age were learning to read and making friends, Sarah was essentially invisible to the world. It was the neighbors who finally noticed that something wasn't right. Neighbors who took it upon themselves to collect used school supplies and enroll a little girl who had been forgotten by everyone who was supposed to protect her. Walking into that first grade classroom at 7 years old, Sarah stood out in all the wrong ways. She was older than the other children, quieter, more watchful. She had learned to read people's faces and moods before she learned to read books, a survival skill that would serve her well, but also mark her as different from the children who came from homes where dinner was on the table every night and someone asked about homework. The years passed slowly in that house with Mrs. Henderson, years where Sarah learned to take care of herself and dream about a father she had never met, but somehow convinced herself would come for her. She would stand at the school gate every afternoon, scanning the faces of parents picking up their children, wondering if today would be the day her father would appear and take her to the family she had invented in her mind. But that day never came. Her father had never even acknowledged her existence, never signed a birth certificate, never sent a birthday card or Christmas gift. Sarah wouldn't even meet him until she was 28 years old, and even then it would be just once, a brief encounter that would leave her more hollow than fulfilled. When Sarah turned 12, her mother reappeared with what seemed like a solution. She had remarried, had another child, and was pregnant again. She needed help with the household, help with the farm where they raised quail, and help with the children who were receiving the attention and care that Sarah had never known. It wasn't really an invitation to join a family. It was a job offer to a 12-year-old girl who was desperate enough to believe it might be something more. Moving to that farm in the small town of Riverside felt like stepping into a different world for Sarah. For the first time, she was living with people who shared her blood, people who called themselves her family. She met aunts and uncles and grandparents who had existed all along but had never been part of her life. It should have been a happy ending to a difficult childhood. But Sarah was about to learn that some families carry their own darkness. Her stepfather seemed kind enough at first, more of a father figure than she had ever known. But kindness can be a mask, and behind that mask was a man who saw a vulnerable, lonely girl who had no one to protect her and nowhere to go. The inappropriate touching started gradually, something Sarah's 12-year-old mind couldn't fully process or understand how to stop. Living in that house meant helping with the farm work, taking care of the younger children, and enduring behavior that no child should ever have to endure. Sarah learned to be vigilant, to avoid being alone with her stepfather when possible, to deflect and escape when she could. As she grew older and stronger, she found ways to defend herself, ways to make it clear that she wouldn't tolerate what was happening to her. But the damage was done. 6 years of walking on eggshells, 6 years of feeling unsafe in the place that was supposed to be her sanctuary. 6 years of understanding that even family could hurt you in ways that left scars no one could see. By the time Sarah was 18, she had survived more trauma than most people experience in a lifetime, and she had learned that survival often meant accepting situations that weren't acceptable, which is perhaps why, when she met William Parker at 18 years old, she mistook possession for protection, mistook control for care. William was almost 30, a man who made his living traveling to Mexico to buy cigarettes and other goods to sell back home. He was charming in the way that older men can be to young women who have never experienced real affection, and he was persistent in a way that Sarah interpreted as romantic interest rather than predatory behavior. Sarah was working at a small diner when William started coming around. A teenager with dreams of escaping her current situation, and finally finding someone who would love her the way she had always imagined being loved. She had a crush on a boy her own age, but her mother discouraged that relationship and instead pushed Sarah toward William, telling her that a mature man would be better for her, that she should give him a chance. The early days of their relationship felt like everything Sarah had been missing her entire life. William showered her with attention, took her on trips across the border, bought her ice cream and small gifts that meant the world to a girl who had never been spoiled by anyone. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt special, felt chosen, felt like maybe she had finally found the family and love she had been searching for. But William Parker was harboring a secret that would shatter Sarah's trust and set the stage for 2 decades of manipulation and control. After 4 or 5 months of what Sarah believed was a loving, committed relationship, William finally revealed that he was married. Not only married, but the father of 3 children, living a double life that Sarah had unknowingly become part of. Most 18-year-old girls would have walked away. Most young women would have recognized the lie for what it was and understood that they deserved better. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't most young women. She was a girl who had learned that love was scarce, and that maybe being someone's second choice was better than being no one's choice at all. So she stayed. Even when her mother found out about William's marriage and forbade Sarah from seeing him, she stayed. Even when the relationship had to be conducted in secret, with Sarah skipping school to meet him and lying about where she was going, she stayed. And when she found herself pregnant at 17 with the child of a married man who was nearly 30, she still stayed. Because by then, Sarah had already learned that leaving meant being alone, and being alone was the one thing she feared more than anything else. What she didn't yet understand was that sometimes staying can be far more dangerous than leaving, and that the man who had promised to protect her would become the source of a different kind of trauma altogether. The pregnancy changed everything. When Sarah's mother discovered that her teenage daughter was carrying the child of a married man, she made a decision that would leave Sarah more vulnerable than ever before. At 7 months pregnant with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, Sarah was kicked out of the only home she had known since childhood. Pregnant, homeless, and entirely dependent on a man who already had a family he was supporting, Sarah found herself moving in with another elderly woman, taking care of someone else while trying to prepare for the arrival of her own child. It was a pattern that would define much of her life, always being the caregiver, always being the one who had to adapt and survive while others made the choices that affected her future. But what nobody knew yet was that this pregnancy was just the beginning of a much longer and darker story. What nobody could predict was that the young woman who was learning to accept being someone's secret would eventually become someone capable of keeping the darkest secret of all. When Sarah Mitchell finally found the courage to tell William Parker that she wanted to end their relationship, she discovered something about him that would haunt her for the next 2 decades. The charming man who had once bought her ice cream and promised to protect her revealed a side of himself that was cold, calculating, and utterly unwilling to let go of what he considered his property. Sarah was 19 years old, living in that cramped basement apartment with 2-year-old Emma, working long hours for barely enough money to cover rent and basic necessities. She had spent months building up the courage to imagine a different life, a life where she might meet someone who would treat her as more than a secret to be hidden away. She had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, She deserved better than the crumbs of affection William was willing to spare from his real life. But William Parker wasn't the kind of man who accepted rejection gracefully. When Sarah told him she wanted him to stay away, wanted to try living her life without constantly waiting for his sporadic visits and empty promises, she saw a rage in his eyes that she had never witnessed before. The man who had convinced her he would protect her became the very person she needed protection from. The first time William hit her, Sarah was so shocked she couldn't even process what had happened. They had been arguing about her decision to end things, with William growing more agitated as it became clear that Sarah wasn't going to change her mind. She had been standing near the small kitchen table in her basement apartment, holding Emma on her hip when William's hand connected with her face with such force that she stumbled backward, her daughter nearly falling from her arms. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma began to cry, sensing her mother's distress, even if she couldn't understand what had just happened. Sarah's cheek burned where William's hand had struck her, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of realizing that the man she had trusted, the man she had believed would never hurt her, had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But the physical violence was only part of William's arsenal. What came next was even more insidious, a psychological warfare that would prove far more effective than any blow. William looked at Sarah holding their crying daughter and delivered the threat that would keep her trapped for years to come. He told her that if she tried to leave him, if she tried to keep him away from their daughter, he would take Emma from her. The threat wasn't empty. William had a steady job, a house, a wife who had accepted the existence of his daughter from another relationship. Sarah was an unmarried teenage mother living in a basement, working a minimum wage job with no family support and no resources to fight a custody battle. If William decided to take Emma away from her, Sarah knew she would have no way to stop him. And just like that, the trap was set. Sarah's love for her daughter, the one pure and beautiful thing in her life, became the weapon William used to control her. You didn't need to threaten Sarah directly, because threatening Emma was far more effective. Sarah would endure anything, accept any treatment, live with any conditions, if it meant keeping her daughter safe and with her. After that first incident, William seemed to understand exactly how much power he wielded over Sarah. He would disappear for weeks at a time, leaving her to wonder if he was done with her, or if he would return with more demands. When he did come back, he acted as if nothing had happened, as if the violence had been some kind of misunderstanding that they had both moved past. But Sarah hadn't moved past anything. She lived in constant fear now, walking on eggshells whenever William was around, never knowing what might trigger another explosion. The basement apartment that had once felt like a sanctuary, a place where she and Emma could build their own little life, now felt like a prison where she waited for the next visit from her captor. The abuse wasn't just physical, though that was certainly part of it. William had discovered that psychological torture was far more effective for long-term control. He would tell Sarah that no other man would ever want her, that she was damaged goods, that any decent man would take one look at her situation and run in the opposite direction. He painted himself as her only option, the generous soul who was willing to overlook her flaws and accept her despite her obvious inadequacies. He was particularly skilled at using Emma as both a weapon and a shield. When he visited, he would shower the little girl with attention and affection, buying her small toys and treats that Sarah couldn't afford on her own. Emma, hungry for any kind of father figure, would light up when William arrived, and Sarah could see how much her daughter loved these rare moments of paternal attention. But William's kindness toward Emma came with strings attached. He would remind Sarah that Emma needed a father, that it would be selfish of Sarah to deprive her daughter of that relationship just because Sarah was being unreasonable about their arrangement. He positioned himself as the loving father and Sarah as the bitter, vindictive mother who was standing in the way of their family's happiness. For 3 years this pattern continued. William would visit when it suited him, sometimes bringing gifts for Emma, sometimes bringing anger and violence for Sarah. He would make promises about leaving his wife and starting a real life with Sarah and Emma. Promises that Sarah knew were lies but desperately wanted to believe. And always hanging over every interaction was the unspoken threat that if Sarah pushed too hard, demanded too much, or tried to escape, she would lose the only thing that mattered to her. During this period, Sarah did try to break free once. She met a man at work, someone kind and age-appropriate, who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her. For a brief moment, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to have a normal relationship with someone who didn't have to sneak around to see her, someone who could take her out in public and introduce her to his friends and family. But William discovered the relationship, and his reaction was swift and brutal. He confronted Sarah with a rage she had never seen before, demanding to know how she could betray their family, how she could expose Emma to strange men who might hurt her. He painted Sarah's attempt at moving on as a betrayal not just of him, but of their daughter's well-being. The ultimatum was simple: end the relationship with the other man, and William would finally leave his wife and commit to building a life with Sarah and Emma. It was the promise Sarah had been waiting to hear for years, the validation that she was worth more than secret visits and hidden relationships. So she ended things with the kind man who had treated her well, choosing instead to believe that William was finally ready to give her the life she had always wanted. Of course, it was another lie. When Sarah ended her relationship with the other man, William's promises of leaving his wife evaporated like morning mist. He went back to his pattern of sporadic visits and empty assurances, but now Sarah was more isolated than ever. She had given up a chance at genuine happiness for a man who would never prioritize her or their daughter, and the weight of that realization was almost unbearable. By the time Emma was 4 years old, Sarah had been worn down by years of psychological manipulation and sporadic violence. When William finally suggested that they try living together, that he would spend more time with them and be more present in Emma's life, Sarah was too exhausted to fight anymore. She had been conditioned to see any attention from William as a gift, any promise of increased commitment as progress. Moving in together felt like a victory to Sarah, even though it meant William was still maintaining his relationship with his wife and other children. At least now Emma would have her father around more often. At least now Sarah wouldn't have to spend weeks wondering when she would see him again. She convinced herself that this arrangement was better than what they had before, that it was a step toward the family life she had always wanted. But what Sarah didn't understand was that living together would only make the abuse worse. When William was visiting sporadically, he had to maintain some level of charm to ensure Sarah would let him back in. But when he was there every day, when Sarah had nowhere to retreat and no reprieve from his presence, the mask he had been wearing finally began to slip completely. The daily abuse began almost immediately. William would wake up angry about something that had happened at work, and Sarah would bear the brunt of his frustration. He would come home having had a fight with his wife, and Sarah would pay the price for his guilt and confusion. Any disagreement, any question, any sign that Sarah had thoughts or opinions of her own would trigger an explosion of violence that left her walking on eggshells for days afterward. Emma, now old enough to understand that something was wrong in their home, began to show signs of the stress she was living under. She became quieter, more withdrawn, clinging to her mother when William's voice was raised and hiding in her room when the arguments began. Sarah watched her bright, curious daughter slowly withdraw into herself and knew that the family life she had thought she was building was actually destroying the very person she had been trying to protect. But leaving felt impossible. William had systematically isolated Sarah from anyone who might help her, convinced her that she was worthless without him, and most importantly, maintained his threat to take Emma away if Sarah ever tried to escape. He had money, stability, and a wife who had accepted Emma as part of their extended family situation. Sarah had nothing except her love for her daughter and an increasing certainty that love might not be enough to save either of them. What Sarah didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The man who had once promised to protect her was just getting started with 20 years of systematic destruction that would eventually push her so far past her breaking point that even she wouldn't recognize the person she would become. And in that freezer in Chicago, 20 years later, lay the evidence of just how far a person can be pushed before something inside them finally snaps. The years that followed would teach Sarah Mitchell that there are gradations of hell, and that just when you think you've reached the bottom, the floor can always give way beneath your feet. Living with William Parker full-time didn't bring the stability and family life she had desperately hoped for. Instead, it revealed the true extent of his capacity for cruelty, and introduced her to a daily existence where terror became as routine as morning coffee. The triggers for William's violence were as unpredictable as they were numerous. If he had a bad day at work, Sarah would pay for his boss's unreasonable demands. If his wife called to argue about money or the children, Sarah would absorb the fury that William couldn't direct at the woman who held his legitimate life in her hands. If Sarah asked a question about their future, expressed an opinion about household decisions, or showed any sign of independent thought, she would be reminded through fists and verbal assault that her role was to accept, not to question. But perhaps most devastating of all were the times when William would suddenly announce that he was going back to spend time with his wife and other children, leaving Sarah to understand that even after moving in together, she was still nothing more than the other woman. These departures would happen without warning, sometimes lasting days, sometimes weeks, while Sarah was left to wonder if this time he might not come back at all. When Sarah would express frustration about this arrangement, when she would dare to suggest that maybe he should choose one family or the other, William's rage would be swift and brutal. How dare she question his decisions? How dare she try to break up his family? The beatings that followed these conversations were particularly vicious, as if William was punishing her not just for speaking up, but for having the audacity to believe she deserved better treatment than what he was giving her. 3 times during those early years of living together, Sarah reached a breaking point and tried to escape. 3 times she gathered what little she could carry, took Emma by the hand, and walked away from the house where they had learned to live in constant fear. And 3 times William hunted her down and dragged her back, using a combination of promises, threats, and psychological manipulation that proved more effective than any physical restraint. The first time Sarah fled, she made it to her friend Cecilia's house, the same woman who had helped her get home from the hospital after Emma's birth. For 2 days, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe this time would be different, that maybe she had finally found the strength to stay away. But William appeared at Cecilia's door with tears in his eyes and apologies on his lips, begging Sarah to give him another chance, promising that he would change, that he would be the man she needed him to be. But underneath the remorse and the promises, there was something else in William's voice that made Sarah's blood run cold. If she didn't come back, he would make sure she regretted it for the rest of her life. If she tried to keep Emma away from him, he would take his daughter and disappear where Sarah would never find them. And if Sarah thought she could embarrass him by running away and telling people about their private business, well, he knew people who could make sure she never told anyone anything ever again. Sarah returned home that first time because she was terrified, but also because she wanted to believe that love could conquer anything, that the man who had once made her feel special and wanted was still somewhere inside the monster who now terrorized her daily. She told herself that if she could just be better, if she could just avoid the things that made him angry, maybe they could find their way back to something resembling happiness. The second escape attempt came 8 months later, after William had beaten her so severely that she could barely walk. This time she made it to a women's shelter 2 towns over, a place where she thought William would never think to look for her. For 5 days, Sarah and Emma lived in a small room with concrete walls and a single window, eating donated food and sleeping on cots that smelled of industrial disinfectant. It should have felt like freedom, but all Sarah could think about was what would happen when William found them, because she knew he would find them. Men like William Parker always found what they were looking for, especially when what they were looking for belonged to them. And in William's mind, Sarah and Emma were his property, possessions that he had every right to reclaim. When William finally tracked them down, he didn't come alone. He brought his brother-in-law, a man who worked in law enforcement and who helped William navigate the system in a way that made Sarah understand just how isolated and powerless she really was. They didn't drag Sarah and Emma out of the shelter by force. They didn't need to. All William had to do was explain to the shelter workers that he was a concerned father whose unstable partner had kidnapped his daughter, and suddenly Sarah found herself being treated like the problem instead of the victim. The third and final escape attempt happened when Emma was 6 years old, and it lasted only 18 hours. By then, Sarah had learned that running away only made things worse, that William's retribution for any attempt at independence was swift and devastating. After that, she stopped trying to leave and instead focused all her energy on a different kind of survival, the day-to-day management of a volatile man whose moods could shift from calm to murderous in the space of a heartbeat. Those 22 years of living with William Parker were not punctuated by moments of genuine happiness. Despite what Sarah sometimes tried to tell herself, there were periods of relative calm, times when William's attention was focused elsewhere, and the house felt almost peaceful. But even during those quieter times, Sarah and Emma lived with the constant awareness that the next explosion was always just around the corner. The pressure was relentless and exhausting. Sarah learned to read William's face like a weather map, studying the subtle signs that indicated whether she should approach him with a question or disappear until his mood improved. She learned to modulate her voice, to make herself smaller, to anticipate his needs before he even knew he had them. Emma learned these skills too, a little girl who became expert at tiptoeing through her own home and gauging her father's emotional temperature before speaking. What made the situation even more surreal was William's ability to present a completely different face to the outside world. In public, he was charming, helpful, the kind of man who would offer to help elderly neighbors with their groceries or volunteer to coach Little League. Friends and acquaintances saw a devoted family man who worked hard to provide for his wife and daughter, someone who seemed to have his life together in all the ways that mattered. This public persona served multiple purposes for William. It gave him cover for his private behavior, making it less likely that anyone would believe Sarah if she tried to tell them what really happened behind closed doors. It also provided him with a network of character witnesses who would vouch for his integrity. If Sarah ever tried to involve law enforcement or social services, most importantly, it reinforced his own narrative that Sarah was the problem in their relationship, that if she would just stop being so difficult and demanding, they could be as happy as everyone thought they were. But there were people who caught glimpses of the real William Parker, moments when his mask slipped and revealed the darkness underneath. Sarah's friend, Maria, witnessed one of William's rages firsthand when she stopped by the house unexpectedly and found him screaming at Sarah with a ferocity that made Maria back slowly toward the door. A neighbor saw William grab Sarah by the arm in their front yard with enough force to leave bruises, yanking her toward the house while hissing threats that carried across the small distance between their properties. These witnesses to William's true nature became important later, people who could attest to the fact that Sarah's eventual claims of abuse weren't fabricated or exaggerated. But at the time, their observations only served to remind Sarah how exposed and vulnerable she was, how many people might see her humiliation, but how few were willing or able to help her escape it. The physical abuse was carefully calculated to inflict maximum pain while minimizing visible evidence. William preferred to hit Sarah in places that would be covered by clothing, focusing on her ribs, her back, her arms and legs. When he did strike her face, it was usually in ways that could be explained away as accidents. Bruises that Sarah could claim came from walking into a door or falling down stairs. Sarah became expert at manufacturing explanations for her injuries, developing an almost creative repertoire of fictional mishaps that she could deploy whenever someone noticed a particularly obvious mark. She slipped in the shower. She tripped over the dog. She walked into a cabinet door that Emma had left open. The lies came so easily after a while that Sarah sometimes forgot which story she had told to which person. But it didn't really matter because most people accepted her explanations without question. As the years passed, the violence escalated in both frequency and severity. What had started as occasional slaps and pushes evolved into systematic beatings that left Sarah unable to move for days at a time. William seemed to grow more confident in his ability to hurt her without consequence, more creative in his methods of inflicting pain, more comfortable with the idea that this was simply what their relationship looked like now. The worst incident came during Emma's 8th year, on a night that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. William had been drinking, which always made him more volatile, and something Sarah said had triggered a rage unlike anything she had ever witnessed. He dragged her into their bedroom, locked the door, and spent the next 12 hours alternating between beating her and threatening to kill her. Emma was in the house during this assault, probably lying awake in her bed listening to her mother's muffled cries and her father's shouted threats. Sarah knew her daughter could hear everything, knew that this night would leave scars on Emma that might never heal, but she was powerless to protect her child from the horror unfolding just down the hall. William's threats that night weren't the usual heated promises made in the moment of anger. They were detailed, specific, methodical. He told Sarah exactly how he would kill her, what he would do with her body, how he would explain her disappearance to Emma and the rest of the world. He made her understand that her death would be easy to arrange and even easier to cover up, that her life was worth so little that no one would question his story about her running away or having an accident. But William's most effective weapon wasn't the threat to kill Sarah. It was his promise to kill Emma if Sarah ever tried to leave him or tell anyone about what happened in their house. He would make it look like an accident, he told her. A tragic case of a little girl who drowned while swimming, or fell down the stairs, or succumbed to some sudden illness that no one could have prevented. And Sarah would have to live with the knowledge that her daughter's death was her fault, the consequence of her inability to keep her mouth shut and accept the life he was generous enough to provide for them. When morning came and William unlocked the bedroom door, he acted as if nothing had happened. He got dressed for work, made himself breakfast, and reminded Sarah that she needed to get Emma ready for school. If Sarah told anyone about their private conversation, he said, tonight's discussion would seem like a friendly chat compared to what would happen next. The psychological warfare was perhaps even more damaging than the physical abuse. William was a master at making Sarah question her own perceptions, her own memories, her own worth as a human being. When she would confront him about his treatment of her, he would deny that anything inappropriate had happened. When she would point to her bruises as evidence, he would remind her that she was clumsy, that she had a tendency to exaggerate, that she was probably remembering things wrong because she was so emotional and unstable. Over time, Sarah began to internalize these messages. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe the bruises weren't as bad as they looked. Maybe William was right when he said that other men would treat her far worse, that she should be grateful for the roof over her head and the food on her table instead of constantly complaining about things that weren't really problems. The isolation was systematic and complete. William discouraged Sarah from maintaining friendships, arguing that other people were just trying to cause trouble in their relationship. He monitored her phone calls, questioned her about every conversation, and made it clear that any relationship Sarah had outside their home was a threat to their family's stability. Gradually, Sarah's world shrank until it included only William, Emma, and the careful management of the emotional landmines that surrounded them both. Emma's relationship with her father was complicated in ways that broke Sarah's heart. William could be genuinely affectionate with his daughter, buying her gifts and taking her on special outings that made her feel loved and valued. But these moments of paternal attention came with strings attached, and as Emma grew older, she began to understand that her father's love was conditional on her loyalty to him and her silence about what happened at home. As Emma entered her teenage years, William became increasingly jealous of the close relationship between mother and daughter. He couldn't stand the idea that Sarah had someone in her life who loved her unconditionally, someone who might eventually give her the strength to leave him. He began to pit them against each other, creating situations where they had to choose sides. manufacturing conflicts that forced them to compete for his approval. Sarah and Emma learned to stage arguments for William's benefit, pretending to be angry with each other when he was around, so that he would feel more secure in his control over both of them. It was a heartbreaking performance that required them to deny the love and support they desperately needed from each other, but it was also a survival strategy that sometimes brought them brief periods of peace. But even these strategies couldn't protect Emma from the reality of growing up in a house where violence was normal and fear was constant. By the time she was 16, Emma had developed anxiety symptoms that interfered with her sleep and her schoolwork. She had trouble trusting people, trouble forming relationships, trouble believing that she deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. When Emma finally left home at 17, it wasn't because she was ready to be independent. It was because she couldn't bear to watch her mother being destroyed any longer, and because she was beginning to fear that William's attention might eventually turn to her in ways that she couldn't handle. Sarah helped her daughter move into the basement apartment of one of Sarah's employers, a woman who was kind enough to provide temporary shelter for a teenager with nowhere else to go. Emma's departure devastated Sarah, but also filled her with relief. At least now she knew her daughter was safe from William's increasingly unpredictable behavior. At least now Emma had a chance to build a life that wasn't defined by the need to manage one man's violent moods. But it also meant that Sarah was now completely alone with William, with no buffer between herself and his rage, no reason to moderate his behavior, because there was no longer a child in the house who might be traumatized by what she witnessed. Throughout all of this, Sarah clung to education as her only hope for eventual escape. Despite William's objections and active sabotage, she managed to finish high school through a correspondence program and eventually enrolled in college to study education. The process took years longer than it should have, because William would frequently prevent her from attending classes or completing assignments. But Sarah persisted with a determination that surprised even her. Studying gave Sarah something that belonged to her alone, something that William couldn't take away. Even when he destroyed her textbooks or prevented her from taking exams, it reminded her that she was intelligent, capable, worthy of more than the life she was living. It planted the seed of an idea that maybe someday she might be able to support herself financially and leave William behind. But William understood the threat that education represented to his control over Sarah, and he fought against it with increasing desperation. He would schedule family obligations during her class times, create emergencies that required her immediate attention, or simply forbid her to leave the house when she was supposed to be studying. When none of those tactics worked, he would escalate to physical violence, beating her so severely that she couldn't sit in a classroom, even if she managed to get there. The farm work was another form of control, a way for William to ensure that Sarah was too exhausted and overwhelmed to focus on anything beyond basic survival. They had moved to a rural property where they raised dairy cattle, work that required attention 7 days a week, twice a day, regardless of weather or Sarah's physical condition. William would disappear for days at a time, leaving Sarah to handle the milking, feeding, and care of dozens of animals while also maintaining the household and trying to keep up with her studies. Emma helped when she could, working alongside her mother, even while attending school and maintaining a part-time job. There were periods when Sarah was attending evening classes that Emma, barely a teenager, would come home from her own job and milk 12 or 13 cows before doing her homework and collapsing into bed. It was an unsustainable situation that ground them both down physically and emotionally. But it was also a demonstration of the resilience and determination that both women had developed in response to years of systematic abuse. Against all odds, Sarah eventually earned her degree in education and began working as a teacher. It was a victory that should have been celebrated, a testament to her intelligence and perseverance in the face of overwhelming obstacles. But for William, Sarah's professional success was another threat to his authority, another sign that she was becoming too independent for his comfort. The final months before everything changed were marked by Sarah's desperate attempts to build some kind of financial independence while hiding her efforts from William. She had found additional work that would supplement her teaching income, evening and weekend positions that could help her save money for the escape she was beginning to plan. But this work had to be done in secret because William had forbidden her from taking on additional employment, viewing any income she earned beyond what he deemed necessary as a form of betrayal. For 2.5 months, Sarah managed to maintain this double life, working her regular teaching job during the day and her secret positions in the evenings and on weekends. She told William she was attending faculty meetings or grading papers, elaborate lies that required careful planning and constant vigilance. The money she earned went into a hidden account that William didn't know about, a small nest egg that might eventually buy her the freedom she had been dreaming about for over 2 decades. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially when you're living with someone who monitors your every move and questions your every absence. And when William Parker finally discovered what Sarah had been doing, when he realized that she had been planning her escape right under his nose, his reaction would be more violent and terrifying than anything that had come before. What Sarah didn't know was that her secret job would be the catalyst for the events that would end with William's body in a freezer and Sarah's life changed forever. After 22 years of surviving daily terror, after decades of being told she was worthless and helpless, Sarah Mitchell was about to discover exactly what she was capable of when pushed beyond her absolute limit. The discovery came on a Tuesday evening in late October, when Sarah's carefully constructed double life finally collapsed in the most terrifying way possible. She had been maintaining her secret employment for 2.5 months, a delicate balancing act that required her to lie about her whereabouts multiple times a week, while accumulating the small amounts of money that might eventually buy her freedom. But on this particular night, when she was supposed to be attending a faculty meeting at the college, William Parker decided to surprise her with an unexpected visit to campus. Sarah was actually 30 miles away in Riverside, working her evening shift at a small office complex, when her phone began buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from William. Where was she? Why wasn't she answering? He had driven to the college to pick her up from her supposed meeting, and when he couldn't find her car in the parking lot, his suspicion had turned to rage with the swiftness of a summer storm. In a panic, Sarah called her friend Linda and begged her to drive her back to the college campus as quickly as possible. She needed to be there when the meeting supposedly ended, needed to maintain the illusion that would keep her secret employment from being discovered. But as Linda drove through the dark country roads at dangerous speeds, Sarah knew that her time was running out. Linda later told investigators that she had never seen anything like it in her life. Here was a grown woman, a college-educated professional, hiding in the passenger seat of a car like a fugitive, terrified that her husband would discover she had been working to support herself. Linda couldn't understand why someone would need to hide the fact that they were earning honest money, but Sarah's fear was so palpable that Linda found herself checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following them through the darkness. They arrived at the college just minutes before the fictional meeting was supposed to end, Sarah's heart pounding as she spotted William's truck already waiting in the parking lot. She composed herself as best she could, walking calmly to his vehicle as if she had just finished, discussing curriculum changes and budget allocations with her colleagues. But William's eyes were cold and suspicious, and Sarah knew that something fundamental had shifted in their already precarious relationship. The interrogation began before they had even left the campus parking lot. Where exactly had the meeting been held? Who else had attended? What specifically had been discussed? William fired questions at Sarah with the intensity of a prosecutor cross-examining a hostile witness, his voice growing more menacing with each answer that didn't satisfy his suspicions. Sarah had prepared for this possibility, developing detailed stories about fictional meetings and imaginary discussions with colleagues whose schedules she had memorized. But under William's relentless questioning, the lies began to feel increasingly fragile, and Sarah could sense that he didn't believe her explanations about why she seemed so nervous, why her clothes smelled different, why she couldn't provide the specific details he demanded about conversations that had never taken place. That night, William's surveillance of Sarah intensified to levels that felt more like imprisonment than marriage. He began showing up at her regular teaching job unexpectedly, claiming he was just stopping by to surprise her, but actually conducting random inspections to ensure she was where she claimed to be. He started checking the mileage on her car, questioning any deviation from the direct route between home and school. He monitored her phone calls more closely, demanding to know who she had spoken to and why. But most terrifyingly, William began making threats that were more specific and detailed than anything Sarah had heard before. He told her that if he ever discovered she was lying to him about anything, the consequences would be worse than anything she could imagine. He described in graphic detail what he would do to her if he found out she was betraying their marriage by working behind his back, threats that made Sarah understand that her secret employment wasn't just forbidden, it was potentially a death sentence. For 2 weeks after that close call, Sarah lived in a state of hypervigilance that was exhausting and unsustainable. Every phone call could be William checking up on her. Every unexpected knock at the door could be him arriving to verify her location. Every evening, when she left the house, required elaborate explanations and carefully planned alibis that had to hold up under interrogation. But the money she was earning from her secret work represented more than just financial independence. It represented hope, the possibility that she might someday have enough resources to escape the prison her life had become. And so, despite the increased danger, Sarah continued working in secret, knowing that discovery would mean unthinkable consequences, but unable to give up what might be her only chance at freedom. The marriage that had taken place just a month earlier, in September 2022, had been another form of control disguised as a practical necessity. William's father had passed away, leaving behind farmland that William wanted to purchase, but he needed to combine his income with Sarah's to qualify for the financing. The wedding wasn't a celebration of love or commitment. It was a business transaction that gave William legal control over Sarah's finances and tied her to him in ways that would make escape even more complicated. Sarah had agreed to the marriage partly because William had convinced her it was necessary for their financial stability, but also because she hoped that legal marriage might somehow legitimize their relationship in ways that could protect her. Perhaps if they were officially husband and wife, William might feel more secure and less likely to suspect her of betrayal. Perhaps the legal recognition would somehow transform their toxic dynamic into something resembling a normal marriage. But if anything, the marriage had made William more possessive and controlling than ever before. Now he had legal standing to make medical decisions for Sarah, to access her bank accounts, to represent himself as her husband in any official capacity. The piece of paper that should have been a symbol of commitment became another tool in William's arsenal of control, another way to ensure that Sarah could never escape his influence. The protective order Sarah had filed in 2019 had been another exercise in futility, a stark reminder of how little protection the legal system could offer to women trapped in abusive relationships. She had finally found the courage to document William's violence, to put his threats and assaults on official record, to ask for legal intervention that might give her some breathing room to figure out how to escape. But the protective order had been nothing more than a piece of paper, and William had treated it with the contempt it deserved. He violated it repeatedly, showing up at Sarah's workplace, calling her phone dozens of times a day, following her when she tried to run errands or visit friends. When Sarah called the police to report these violations, she was told that unless William actually attacked her while officers were present, there was little they could do beyond documenting the incidents. The message was clear. Sarah was on her own. The legal system might be willing to file paperwork and issue official-sounding documents, but when it came to actually protecting her from a man who had promised to kill her, she would have to rely on her own resources and hope that William's threats remained just threats. Eventually, William had worn Sarah down to the point where she agreed to withdraw the protective order altogether. He had promised to change, to get counseling, to work on their relationship in ways that would make legal intervention unnecessary. But mostly, he had made it clear that the protective order was making him angrier and more unpredictable, and that Sarah's safety would be better served by removing this source of irritation from their lives. By November 2022, Sarah's world had shrunk to the size of a prison cell. She couldn't visit friends without William's permission. She couldn't go to a hair salon without him timing her appointment and demanding explanations for any delay. She couldn't attend work-related social events without William either accompanying her or conducting surprise inspections to ensure she was where she claimed to be. Even the most basic aspects of personal grooming had become sources of conflict and suspicion. If Sarah spent too long getting ready for work, William would accuse her of trying to attract the attention of male colleagues. If she bought new clothes or changed her hairstyle, he would demand to know who she was trying to impress. If she wore makeup to school events, he would interrogate her about which men would be present and whether she was planning to flirt with any of them. The professional gatherings that should have been opportunities for Sarah to connect with colleagues and maintain some semblance of a normal social life became elaborate exercises in documentation and verification. William would demand photographic evidence of her attendance, video calls to prove her location, and detailed reports about every conversation she had with every person at every event. When Sarah attended evening meetings or weekend workshops, she was required to provide William with the exact address, the names of all attendees, and regular updates throughout the event. Any deviation from her reported schedule, any unexpected delay, any failure to respond immediately to his text messages would result in interrogation sessions that could last for hours and often escalated to physical violence. The Saturday evening in early November that would set the final tragedy in motion began as what should have been a simple, innocent gathering of female teachers sharing a pizza and conversation. Sarah had been looking forward to this modest social event for weeks, a rare opportunity to spend time with colleagues outside the suffocating atmosphere of her home life. She had followed all of William's requirements for such outings, providing him with the restaurant's address, the names of the women who would be attending, and regular updates about her location and activities. She had made video calls to prove she was where she claimed to be, sent photographs of her surroundings, and assured him repeatedly that this was a women-only gathering with no male colleagues present. But despite all of these precautions, despite Sarah's careful compliance with every rule William had established for her social interactions, he had decided to conduct a surprise inspection. Without warning or explanation, he appeared at the restaurant, walking through the door with a casual smile that didn't hide the cold calculation in his eyes. The humiliation Sarah felt in that moment was almost unbearable. Here she was, a professional woman, a college graduate, a respected teacher, being checked up on by her husband as if she were a wayward teenager who couldn't be trusted to have dinner with friends. Her colleagues tried to hide their shock and confusion, but Sarah could see the questions in their eyes, the dawning understanding that something was very wrong in her marriage. William played the role of the loving husband who had decided to surprise his wife with an unexpected visit, but Sarah knew better. This wasn't affection or spontaneity. It was a calculated demonstration of his power over her, a reminder that nowhere was safe from his surveillance and control. Even when she followed all his rules, even when she provided all the documentation and verification he demanded, he could still appear at any moment to remind her who was really in charge of her life. The conversation that followed when they returned home that night was a masterclass in psychological warfare. William didn't accuse Sarah of any specific wrongdoing, but he made it clear that her behavior at the restaurant had been inappropriate in ways she was too stupid to understand. She had been too friendly with the waitress, too animated in her conversations with her colleagues, too comfortable in a social setting that didn't include him. But what had really triggered William's fury was the discovery that Sarah's colleagues were planning a weekend trip, a modest getaway to a nearby resort where they could relax and enjoy each other's company away from the stresses of their demanding jobs. Several of the women had mentioned this trip during dinner, and they had invited Sarah to join them, an invitation that filled her with both longing and terror. The idea of spending an entire weekend away from William, of sleeping in a bed where she didn't have to worry about being awakened by his fists or his threats, of having conversations that didn't require careful monitoring of his mood, was so appealing that Sarah could barely bring herself to think about it. But she also knew that asking for permission to join this trip would be like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. Still, something inside Sarah had begun to shift during those months of secret employment, those small tastes of financial independence and personal autonomy. She had started to remember who she had been before William Parker entered her life, started to imagine who she might become if she could ever escape his control. And so, despite her fear, despite her better judgment, despite years of conditioning that had taught her never to ask for anything that might trigger his rage, Sarah decided to request permission to join her colleagues on their weekend trip. The conversation began on Sunday morning, November 13th, with Sarah approaching William carefully, choosing her words with the precision of a diplomat negotiating a ceasefire. She explained that her colleagues had invited her on a modest weekend getaway, that it would be an opportunity for professional development and team building, that she would pay for the trip herself and would be back home by Monday evening. William's reaction was swift and brutal, without warning, without giving Sarah a chance to explain further or negotiate the terms of her request. He struck her across the face with enough force to knock her backward. The blow was accompanied by a simple, non-negotiable declaration. She would not be going on any trip with anyone at any time for any reason. But William wasn't finished. As Sarah held her stinging cheek and tried to process what had just happened, he delivered a threat that made her blood freeze. If she defied him, if she attempted to leave the house for this trip or any other unauthorized purpose, he would track her down and kill her. Not hurt her, not punish her, but actually end her life. And then, just to ensure she understood the full scope of his commitment to this threat, he promised that Emma would be next. Sarah spent the rest of Sunday in a state of shock that was both familiar and somehow different from the aftermath of William's previous assaults. She called her colleagues to explain that she wouldn't be able to join them after all, claiming she was feeling unwell, a lie that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as her life spiraled further out of control. But something had changed in Sarah during that brief conversation about the weekend trip, something that even William's violence couldn't completely extinguish. For just a moment, she had allowed herself to imagine a different life, a life where she could make decisions about her own time and activities, a life where she didn't need permission to exist. And now that she had glimpsed that possibility, it was becoming harder to accept the alternative. Monday, November 14th, began like any other day in the Parker household, with Sarah tiptoeing around William's volatile mood and trying to gauge whether it was safe to speak or better to remain silent. William had worked the night shift and was preparing to rest before his next shift, a routine that usually meant Sarah had a few hours of relative peace while he slept. But as William prepared to leave for work that evening, something inside Sarah snapped. Maybe it was the memory of her colleague's invitation and her desperate desire to join them. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of 22 years of threats and violence and psychological torture. Maybe it was simply the realization that if she didn't find the courage to ask for what she wanted now, she might never find it again. Against every instinct that had kept her alive for over 2 decades, Sarah approached William one more time about the weekend trip. She knew it was dangerous, knew that asking again, after being explicitly forbidden, was a form of defiance that William would not tolerate. But some small part of her, the part that still remembered who she had been before she learned to live in fear, refused to accept that her life would always be dictated by one man's need for absolute control. William's response to this second request was not just violent, it was apocalyptic. The man who had spent 22 years training Sarah to accept his authority, to never question his decisions, to live in constant fear of his displeasure, was confronted with evidence that his control was not as complete as he had believed, and his reaction would finally push Sarah Mitchell past the point of no return. The threat he made that Monday evening was different from all the others that had come before it. This wasn't a warning designed to ensure future compliance. It was a promise of immediate consequences. If Sarah left the house for any reason other than work, if she defied his explicit command to abandon any thoughts of the weekend trip, if she showed any further signs of the independence that threatened his absolute authority over her life, he would kill her the moment she returned home. But William made one crucial mistake that night. In his rage, in his desperate need to reassert his dominance over a woman who was beginning to show signs of rebellion, he pushed Sarah beyond fear and into a place where survival required action rather than submission. After 22 years of accepting the unacceptable, of enduring the unendurable, of believing that tomorrow might somehow be different from today, Sarah Mitchell finally reached the point where she had nothing left to lose. What happened next would shock investigators, prosecutors, and the entire community that had known Sarah and William as just another middle-aged couple trying to make their way through life. But for anyone who understood the psychology of long-term abuse, for anyone who knew how far a human being could be pushed before something fundamental breaks inside them, what happened next was perhaps the only outcome that could have resulted from 22 years of systematic torture disguised as marriage. In that freezer in Chicago, investigators would eventually discover not just the remains of William Parker, but the physical evidence of a woman who had finally found the strength to say no to a man who had never accepted that word as an answer. The human mind is a remarkable thing in its capacity to endure suffering, but every person has a breaking point, a moment when the psyche can no longer absorb another blow without something fundamental shifting inside. For Sarah Mitchell, that moment came on Monday evening, November 14th, 2022, when she realized that William Parker's latest threat wasn't just another tool of control, but a promise of her own imminent death. In the weeks leading up to that fateful night, Sarah had begun experiencing something that terrified her almost as much as William's violence. She had started wanting to die. The woman who had survived decades of abuse through sheer determination to protect her daughter had reached a place where death seemed preferable to another day of living in fear. Multiple times she had considered various ways to end her own suffering, moments of despair so profound that only thoughts of Emma alone in the world had pulled her back from the edge. There had been the incident in the car when William was driving and screaming at her about some perceived failure on her part, and Sarah had seriously considered opening the door and throwing herself into traffic. The idea of dying quickly in an accident seemed merciful compared to the slow, psychological torture of continuing to live under William's control. But even in that moment of desperate hopelessness, she couldn't bring herself to abandon Emma to face the world without, the one person who truly understood what she had endured. The thoughts of self-harm had become more frequent and more detailed as the months passed. Sarah would find herself staring at oncoming trucks when she drove to work, calculating whether a deliberate collision would look accidental enough to spare Emma the knowledge that her mother had chosen to leave her. She would stand at the edge of bridges, wondering if the fall would be quick, if the pain would be brief, if Emma would somehow understand that this wasn't abandonment, but release. But every time these dark thoughts threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah would remember her daughter's face, would think about Emma having to navigate the world with only William Parker as her guide and protector, and would find the strength to step back from whatever age she was approaching. Emma was her anchor to life, the only thing that made survival worth the effort, the reason she kept getting up every morning, despite knowing that the day would bring only more fear and pain. However, by November 2022, even thoughts of Emma weren't enough to counteract the exhaustion that had settled into Sarah's bones. 22 years of hypervigilance had worn her down to the point where she could barely function, where every sound made her jump, where every interaction with William required careful calculation of his mood and the possible consequences of her words or actions. The weekend trip that her colleagues had planned represented something Sarah had almost forgotten existed, the possibility of joy. The idea of spending 2 days away from William's surveillance, of sleeping through the night without fear, of having conversations that didn't require monitoring and editing every word, was so appealing that it felt like a glimpse of heaven. But more than that, it represented agency, the revolutionary concept that Sarah might have the right to make decisions about her own time and activities. When William delivered his ultimatum on Monday evening, when he made it clear that any attempt to join her colleagues would result in her death, something inside Sarah's mind that had been holding on by the thinnest of threads finally snapped. This wasn't just another threat designed to ensure compliance. This was William's declaration that Sarah's life was so completely under his control that she didn't even have the right to exist if she displayed any signs of independence. For the first time in decades, Sarah found herself thinking not about survival, but about resistance. The woman who had learned to absorb violence without fighting back, who had trained herself to accept the unacceptable in order to protect her daughter, suddenly found herself imagining what it would feel like to say no to William Parker and mean it. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. What would happen if she simply refused to accept his authority over her life? What would happen if she stopped being afraid of his threats and started focusing on the fact that those threats themselves were evidence of his own fear, his desperate need to maintain control over someone who was beginning to remember that she had once been a person with her own thoughts and desires and dreams. But Sarah also understood the reality of her situation with painful clarity. William wasn't making empty threats. He was promising specific consequences for specific actions. If she defied him, if she tried to assert any independence, he would follow through on his promises to hurt her and Emma in ways that would destroy whatever remained of their lives. It was this understanding that led Sarah to a conclusion that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. If William was determined to kill her for showing signs of independence, if her choice was between dying as his victim or dying as someone who had finally found the courage to resist, then maybe the time had come to stop being afraid of death and start being afraid of continuing to live as William Parker's prisoner. The medication that Sarah gave William that evening wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, though the final action would be taken in a moment of clarity that felt both inevitable and surreal. Sarah had been William's unofficial nurse for years, managing his various prescriptions and ensuring he took his medications on schedule. She knew which pills made him drowsy, which combinations would ensure deep sleep, which dosages would keep him unconscious for hours at a time. As she prepared William's evening medications, adding an extra dose of the sleep aids that he took regularly for his chronic insomnia, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. For the first time in decades, she was taking action instead of simply reacting, making a choice instead of having choices made for her. The woman who had spent 22 years anticipating William's moods and trying to prevent his explosions was finally planning instead of just surviving. When William took his medications without question, trusting the woman who had been managing his health care for years, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since she was 18 years old: power. For 30 minutes, as William settled into bed and gradually succumbed to the chemical sleep that would make him vulnerable in ways he had never imagined, Sarah sat in their living room and thought about 22 years of accumulated trauma, 22 years of threats and violence and psychological torture. She thought about Emma, growing up in a house where fear was the primary emotion, where love was conditional and safety was always temporary. She thought about her own mother, who had abandoned her children rather than protect them. She thought about the dreams she had once had. The person she had been before William Parker convinced her that she was worthless and helpless and lucky to have anyone willing to tolerate her existence. And she thought about the weekend trip, about her colleagues who would be spending 2 days laughing and relaxing and enjoying each other's company, while Sarah remained trapped in a house where asking for permission to breathe would be considered an act of rebellion. The decision, when it finally crystallized in Sarah's mind, didn't feel like a choice at all. It felt like the only possible response to a situation that had become completely intolerable. William had promised to kill her if she showed any signs of independence, had threatened to hurt Emma if Sarah ever tried to escape his control, had made it clear that her life and her daughter's safety were entirely dependent on his whims and his willingness to let them continue existing. But in that moment, as William lay unconscious and vulnerable, Sarah realized that his threats only had power if she continued to believe that his life was more valuable than her freedom. For 22 years, she had operated under the assumption that keeping William alive and pacified was worth any amount of suffering on her part. But what if that assumption was wrong? What if the only way to truly protect herself and Emma was to eliminate the source of the threat altogether? The act itself, when Sarah finally committed to it, was remarkably quiet and peaceful. There was no struggle, no violence, no dramatic confrontation between victim and abuser. William never woke up, never realized what was happening, never had the opportunity to fight back or beg for mercy or promise to change his behavior. One moment he was breathing, and the next moment he wasn't, and Sarah found herself looking down at the man who had terrorized her for over 2 decades, finally powerless to hurt anyone ever again. The logistics of what came next were handled with the same methodical calm that had characterized Sarah's decision-making throughout the evening. She couldn't leave William's body in their bedroom, couldn't risk discovery before she had time to figure out her next steps. The large freezer in their basement, which they had used for storing meat and frozen vegetables, became the temporary solution to an immediate problem. Moving William's body required all of Sarah's strength and determination, but adrenaline and necessity made possible what should have been physically impossible for a woman of her size. She wrapped him in bed linens, dragged him down the stairs, and managed to position him in the freezer, closing the lid on 22 years of abuse and terror with a soft click that echoed through the silent house. And then, in a decision that would later seem incomprehensible to investigators and prosecutors, Sarah cleaned up any evidence of what had happened, got dressed in clothes appropriate for a weekend getaway, and drove to meet her colleagues at the resort where they were beginning their planned retreat. For the next 2 days, Sarah Mitchell participated in the weekend trip that had triggered the final confrontation with William, laughing with her colleagues, sharing meals, and joining in conversations about everything, except the fact that her husband's body was currently stored in their basement freezer. To everyone around her, she seemed like a woman finally able to relax and enjoy herself, someone who had temporarily escaped whatever stresses normally weighed her down. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she was finally experiencing the freedom and peace that William had tried to prevent her from having, that his death had given her the weekend of joy he had been determined to deny her. But the surreal nature of the situation, the disconnect between her outward behavior and the reality of what she had done, created a psychological state that was both liberating and terrifying. When Sarah returned home on Monday evening, she began the performance that would define the next several days of her life. The worried wife, whose husband had mysteriously disappeared. She called his workplace, contacted his friends, filed a missing person report with the police, and played the role of a woman desperate to find her missing spouse. The investigation that followed was relatively brief, as these things go. William Parker wasn't the kind of man who disappeared without a trace, wasn't someone with a history of running away or starting new lives in distant places. When police began searching the Parker house more thoroughly, looking for clues about what might have happened to the missing husband, it didn't take long for someone to notice that the basement freezer was locked, which struck the investigating officers as unusual. Sarah was present when they opened the freezer, and she watched their faces change as they realized what they were looking at. After days of pretending to search for a missing man, after maintaining the fiction that she was a worried wife whose husband had simply vanished, the physical evidence of what she had done was finally revealed to the world. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Sarah's arrest and the beginning of her legal proceedings was her emotional response to finally being caught. Instead of fear or regret or despair, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: relief. For the first time since she was 18 years old, she was facing a future where William Parker couldn't hurt her, couldn't threaten her, couldn't use Emma as a weapon against her. The irony of finding freedom in a jail cell wasn't lost on Sarah, but it wasn't incomprehensible either. Prison, with its rules and schedules and limited freedoms, still offered more autonomy than her marriage had provided. In prison, she could speak to other people without monitoring every word for possible offense. She could sleep through the night without fear of being awakened by fists or threats. She could make small decisions about her daily routine without calculating the possible violent consequences. Most importantly, Emma was finally safe from William's influence and control. The daughter who had learned to tiptoe through her own home, who had staged arguments with her mother to avoid triggering her father's jealousy, who had eventually fled rather than continue watching her mother's systematic destruction, was now free to build a relationship with Sarah without interference or surveillance. When Sarah called Emma from jail to explain what had happened, she was prepared for her daughter's shock, anger, or rejection. What she wasn't prepared for was Emma's immediate offer of support and understanding. Her daughter, now 22 years old and finally able to speak freely about what their family life had really been like, told Sarah that she had known something terrible was going to happen, that the situation at home had become unsustainable, that she was relieved her mother was finally safe, even if that safety came at such a tremendous cost. The conversations between mother and daughter in the weeks following Sarah's arrest were the first honest communication they had been able to have in years. Without William's presence to monitor and control their interactions, they could finally acknowledge the trauma they had both endured, could discuss the fear that had shaped their entire relationship, could begin the process of healing from decades of systematic abuse. Emma admitted that she had fantasized about her father's death many times over the years, that she had worried constantly about her mother's safety, that leaving home had been as much about self-preservation as it had been about escaping an unbearable situation. She told Sarah that while she couldn't condone what had happened, she understood it, and that for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what her father might do next. The legal system would eventually have to grapple with the complex questions raised by Sarah's case. How does society judge a woman who endured decades of abuse before finally striking back? How do you balance the crime that was committed against the circumstances that led to it? How do you sentence someone whose actions were simultaneously inexcusable and understandable? But for Sarah herself, the legal consequences seemed almost secondary to the psychological liberation she had achieved. She had spent 22 years believing that she was powerless, that her life was entirely at the mercy of William Parker's moods and decisions. That survival required accepting whatever treatment he decided to inflict on her. The knowledge that she had been capable of taking control of her own life, even in such a drastic and permanent way, had fundamentally changed how Sarah saw herself and her place in the world. She was no longer the helpless victim who had to endure whatever was done to her. No longer the woman who believed that someone else's life was more important than her own freedom and safety. The guilt and remorse that Sarah felt about William's death were real and complicated, mixed with relief and a sense of justice that she struggled to reconcile with her understanding of right and wrong. She knew that what she had done was morally indefensible in any objective sense, knew that taking another person's life was a line that shouldn't be crossed regardless of the circumstances. But she also knew that William Parker had been systematically destroying her and Emma for over 2 decades, that his promises to kill them weren't empty threats, but plans he was actively working toward, that the situation had reached a point where someone was going to die, and the only question was whether it would be him or her. In the quiet moments when Sarah allowed herself to think about alternative outcomes, she couldn't imagine any scenario where she and Emma would have been able to escape William's control through conventional means. The protective order had been meaningless, law enforcement had been ineffective, and William's escalating threats suggested that he was moving toward a final confrontation that would have ended with Sarah's death rather than his. The friends and colleagues who had known Sarah before her arrest struggled to reconcile the quiet, competent teacher they remembered with the woman who had killed her husband and stored his body in their basement freezer. But those who had caught glimpses of William's true nature, who had witnessed his controlling behavior and explosive temper, found Sarah's actions more comprehensible, even if they remained shocking. Emma's support became Sarah's anchor during the legal proceedings that followed, a reminder that her actions had achieved their primary purpose, protecting her daughter from a man who had threatened to destroy both of their lives. The relationship between mother and daughter, freed from William's interference and surveillance, began to heal in ways that neither of them had thought possible while he was alive. The weekend trip that had triggered the final confrontation took on symbolic importance for both women. representing the simple human desire for freedom and autonomy that William had been determined to deny them. In a terrible irony, Sarah's crime had given her the peace and independence that a simple request for 2 days away from home had been denied. As Sarah prepared for the legal consequences of her actions, she found herself thinking often about other women trapped in similar situations, women who were enduring the same cycle of abuse and threats and psychological torture that had defined her own life for over 2 decades. She wondered how many of them were contemplating the same desperate solutions she had chosen. How many were calculating whether death might be preferable to continued subjugation. The tragedy of Sarah Mitchell's story wasn't just that she had reached a point where murder seemed like her only option for escape, but that the system designed to protect women like her had failed so completely that she felt she had no choice but to protect herself through violence. The protective orders and police reports and social services that should have provided alternatives to her desperate solution had proved inadequate to the reality of living with a man determined to maintain absolute control over another human being. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all was Sarah's own statement that she felt more free in a jail cell awaiting trial for murder than she had ever felt in her own home with the man who had promised to love and protect her. That a woman could find liberation in imprisonment spoke to the depth of the terror she had endured and the completeness of the control William Parker had exercised over every aspect of her existence. The freezer in that Chicago basement would eventually be removed as evidence, but what it represented, the final resting place of a man whose need for dominance had ultimately led to his own destruction, would remain a symbol of what happens when abuse is allowed to escalate without intervention, when victims are left to find their own solutions to problems that society should have helped them solve. The most profound irony of Sarah Mitchell's story became clear in the days following her arrest, when friends and colleagues began sharing their memories of conversations they had had with her over the years. Multiple women came forward to say that Sarah had been the one who encouraged them to leave abusive relationships, who had told them that no man had the right to control or hurt them, who had been their strongest advocate for independence and self-respect. The woman who couldn't save herself had spent years trying to save others, offering advice she was unable to follow, seeing solutions for everyone except the person staring back at her in the mirror. Linda, the colleague who had driven Sarah to the college that night to maintain her alibi about the secret job, remembered dozens of conversations where Sarah had been adamant that women should never tolerate abuse from their partners. She recalled Sarah saying that any man who raised his hand to a woman was showing his true character, that promises to change were meaningless without sustained behavioral proof, that isolation from friends and family was always a red flag that indicated deeper problems in a relationship. These conversations had taken place during lunch breaks at school, during faculty meetings, during the brief social interactions that William allowed Sarah to have with her colleagues. Each time one of her friends mentioned relationship problems, Sarah would become passionate and articulate about the importance of maintaining independence, setting boundaries, and refusing to accept treatment that diminished one's sense of self-worth. Maria, another teacher who had worked with Sarah for over a decade, remembered being shocked by the intensity of Sarah's reactions to stories about controlling husbands or boyfriends. Sarah would become almost angry when she heard about women who were being isolated from their families, who had to account for every minute of their time, who were being criticized and belittled by their partners. She would lecture her friends about the importance of financial independence, about maintaining their own bank accounts, about never allowing a man to dictate their friendships or career choices. The cruel irony was that while Sarah was giving this advice, she was living the exact opposite reality. While she was telling her friends that they deserved better treatment, she was going home to a man who monitored her every movement and punished her for any signs of independent thought. While she was encouraging other women to value themselves enough to leave toxic relationships, she was accepting violence and threats as the price of keeping her own family together. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the realization that Sarah's advice to other women came from her intimate knowledge of what abuse looked like, her ability to recognize the warning signs because she was living with all of them every single day. Her passion for helping other women escape toxic relationships wasn't theoretical or academic. It was born from her own desperate understanding of what it meant to lose yourself completely to another person's need for control. The psychological complexity of Sarah's situation became even more apparent when her friends began to understand how carefully she had hidden her own circumstances. They remembered times when Sarah had arrived at work with bruises she attributed to clumsiness, when she had seemed distracted or anxious but had explained it away as work stress or family obligations. They recalled how she would sometimes check her phone obsessively during social gatherings, how she would suddenly have to leave events early because of mysterious emergencies at home. But because Sarah was so effective at helping other women recognize abuse in their own relationships, her friends had never applied the same analytical skills to her situation. She had been the strong one, the advocate, the woman who had answers for everyone else's problems. The idea that she might be trapped in the very situation she warned others about seemed impossible, a cognitive dissonance that prevented people from seeing what was happening right in front of them. The shame that had kept Sarah silent about her own abuse was something that many domestic violence experts recognized as one of the most insidious aspects of long-term psychological manipulation. Abusers are particularly skilled at making their victims feel responsible for the abuse they endure, convincing them that they somehow deserve the treatment they receive, that their own inadequacies have provoked their partner's violence. William had spent 22 years convincing Sarah that she was lucky he was willing to stay with her despite her many flaws, that other men would treat her far worse, that her own behavior was the source of the problems in their relationship. This systematic erosion of self-worth made it almost impossible for Sarah to seek help, because doing so would require her to admit that the man she had built her life around was the source of her suffering rather than her salvation. The isolation that William had imposed on Sarah was another factor that made escape seem impossible. By controlling her social interactions, monitoring her communications, and creating conflict around her friendships, he had systematically removed the support network that might have given her the strength and resources to leave. When Sarah looked around for help, she found herself surrounded by people who knew her only as William allowed them to know her. People who had no idea what her home life was really like. But perhaps most devastating was the way William had weaponized Sarah's love for Emma, using her maternal instincts as a tool of control rather than recognizing them as evidence of her strength and devotion. Every threat against Emma was calculated to remind Sarah that her daughter's safety depended on her continued compliance, that any attempt to escape would put the person she loved most in the world at risk. The revelation that William's own children from his first marriage had played virtually no role in his life, beyond what they could extract from him, financially added another layer of complexity to the case. These adult children, who had grown up knowing their father as someone who abandoned his family responsibilities to pursue other relationships, had nonetheless appeared after his death to claim whatever inheritance might be available. Their reaction to Sarah's arrest was predictable in its focus on their own losses, rather than any genuine grief for their father's death. They were concerned about the house, the property, the life insurance policies, and other financial assets that William's death might affect. But according to Emma, they had never shown any real interest in William as a person, never made efforts to maintain meaningful relationships with him, never seemed to value him for anything beyond his ability to provide them with money when they needed it. This information painted a picture of William Parker as a man who had never learned how to form healthy, reciprocal relationships with anyone in his life. His connection to his first family had been primarily financial. His relationship with Sarah had been based on control and manipulation, and even his bond with Emma had been complicated by his jealousy and possessiveness. He was a man who took rather than gave, who demanded rather than earned, who maintained relationships through fear and obligation rather than love and mutual respect. The legal proceedings that lay ahead for Sarah would force the justice system to grapple with questions that had no easy answers. How do you sentence a woman who endured decades of systematic abuse before finally striking back? How do you balance the severity of taking another person's life against the circumstances that led to that desperate action? How do you judge someone whose crime was simultaneously inexcusable and understandable? Sarah herself seemed to understand that she would face significant prison time for her actions, and she had accepted this consequence with a resigned pragmatism that spoke to her fundamental exhaustion with fighting for survival. She knew that what she had done was legally and morally wrong, knew that society could not condone vigilante justice regardless of the provocation, knew that there would be people who would never be able to understand or forgive her actions. But she also knew that for the first time in over 2 decades, she was safe from William Parker's threats and violence. She knew that Emma was finally free to build a relationship with her mother without interference or surveillance. She knew that whatever sentence she received, whatever hardships awaited her in the criminal justice system, they could not be worse than the daily terror she had endured as William's wife. The strange liberation that Sarah felt in her jail cell became a recurring theme in conversations with her legal team and the mental health professionals who were evaluating her case. Here was a woman who had found freedom in the most unlikely place, who felt more autonomous as a defendant in a murder trial than she had ever felt as a supposedly free citizen living in her own home. This paradox spoke to the completeness of William's control over Sarah's life, the extent to which he had managed to transform their home into a prison where every action was monitored. Every decision was subject to his approval. Every moment of peace was temporary and conditional. The rigid structure of jail, with its rules and schedules and limited freedoms, still offered more personal autonomy than Sarah had experienced in her marriage. The relationship between Sarah and Emma began to heal in ways that neither of them had thought possible while William was alive. For the first time in Emma's adult life, she could visit her mother without fear of triggering her father's jealousy or anger. For the first time in decades, Sarah could speak to her daughter without calculating how their conversation might be used against her later. These visits became precious opportunities for both women to begin processing the trauma they had shared, to acknowledge the ways that William's abuse had affected not just Sarah but Emma as well. They could finally discuss the fear that had permeated their entire relationship, the careful strategies they had developed to avoid triggering William's rage, the love they had shared despite the dangerous circumstances that surrounded them. Emma's support for her mother, while unwavering, was complicated by her own grief and anger about the situation they had all found themselves in. She grieved for the childhood she had lost to her father's volatility, for the years she had spent protecting her mother when she should have been protecting herself, for the normalcy that had never been possible in their household. But Emma also felt a profound relief that the constant fear was finally over, that she no longer had to worry about what her father might do to her mother during his next explosive episode. She could sleep through the night without wondering if she would wake up to find that William had finally followed through on his threats to kill Sarah. She could make plans for the future without having to consider how her father might interfere with or sabotage her goals. The guilt that both women felt about finding relief in William's death was something they would need to work through with professional help over the months and years ahead. It was natural, too, feel grateful that the source of their terror was gone, but it was also difficult to reconcile those feelings with the knowledge that a human life had been lost, that Emma had lost her father regardless of how complicated that relationship had been. The media attention that surrounded Sarah's case brought with it a broader conversation about domestic violence and the failures of the systems designed to protect victims of abuse. Advocates pointed out that Sarah had tried to use legal remedies, had filed police reports and sought protective orders, but had found these interventions inadequate to address the reality of living with someone determined to maintain absolute control over her life. The protective order that Sarah had obtained and then withdrawn became a particular focus of criticism from those who argued that the legal system was not equipped to handle the complex dynamics of intimate partner violence. Critics pointed out that such orders often escalated rather than reduced the danger to victims, that they provided a false sense of security, while actually increasing the abuser's motivation to act. Before law enforcement could intervene, Sarah's case also highlighted the isolation and shame that prevented many abuse victims from seeking help or accepting assistance when it was offered. The fact that she had been able to maintain her professional responsibilities while enduring systematic torture at home demonstrated the lengths to which victims would go to protect their abusers' reputations and maintain the fiction that their relationships were normal. The women who had received Sarah's advice about leaving abusive relationships found themselves questioning whether they had missed signs of her own situation, whether there was something they could have done to help her, if they had been more observant or more willing to probe beneath the surface of her apparent competence and strength. But domestic violence experts pointed out that Sarah's ability to help others while being unable to help herself was not unusual or contradictory. Many victims of abuse became experts in recognizing the warning signs precisely because they were living with all of them, and their advice to others often reflected their own desperate understanding of what healthy relationships should look like. The shame and self-blame that kept Sarah from seeking help for herself, while encouraging others to seek help, was also recognized as a common pattern among abuse victims. It was easier to see solutions for other people's problems than to apply those same solutions to their own lives, especially when their abusers had convinced them that their situations were uniquely hopeless, or that they were somehow responsible for the treatment they received. As Sarah prepared for the legal proceedings ahead, she found herself thinking often about the weekend trip that had triggered the final confrontation with William, the simple request for 2 days of freedom that had seemed so threatening to him that he had been willing to kill her rather than allow it. The irony that his death had given her the peace and autonomy he had been determined to deny her was not lost on Sarah, even as she prepared to spend years in prison as a consequence of her actions. But more than anything, Sarah hoped that her story might serve as a warning to other women who were living in situations similar to what she had endured. She wanted them to understand that the escalation of abuse was often gradual and insidious, that what seemed manageable in the early stages could become deadly over time, that the promises to change were almost always meaningless without sustained behavioral evidence. Most importantly, she wanted other women to understand that the shame and isolation that made escape seem impossible were weapons that abusers used deliberately, that the voice telling them they were worthless and helpless was not their own voice, but their abuser's voice, that they deserved love and respect and safety regardless of what they had been told about their own inadequacies. The case of Sarah Mitchell and William Parker would eventually be resolved through the legal system, with judges and juries determining the appropriate consequences for actions that defied easy categorization. But the broader questions raised by their story about the nature of abuse and the failures of protection and the point at which victims become perpetrators would continue to challenge society's understanding of justice and mercy and the complex realities of intimate partner violence. In the end, Sarah's story was both unique in its specific details and tragically common in its basic dynamics. Thousands of women were living in similar situations at that very moment, calculating whether survival was worth the cost of continued subjugation, wondering if death might be preferable to another day of terror, hoping that somehow, some way, they might find the strength to escape before it was too late. For some of those women, Sarah's story would serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing abuse to escalate to its ultimate conclusion. For others, it would serve as a reminder that even the strongest and most capable people could find themselves trapped in situations that seemed to have no solution except the most desperate one. And for all of them, Sarah's final words carried a message that transcended the specific circumstances of her case, that no one deserved to live in fear, that love should never require accepting violence, that the voice telling them they were powerless was lying, and that somewhere, somehow, there had to be a way to find safety that didn't require destroying another human being in the process. The freezer in that Chicago basement had been emptied and taken away as evidence, but what it represented, the final resting place of a relationship that had consumed 2 decades and 2 lives, would remain as a stark reminder of what happened when abuse was allowed to continue unchecked, when victims were left to find their own solutions to problems that society should have helped them solve. Sarah Mitchell's story was over, but the questions it raised about protection and justice and the breaking point of human endurance would continue long after the legal proceedings concluded and the media attention moved on to other tragedies. Somewhere, in houses that looked perfectly normal from the outside, other women were living Sarah's story, and their outcomes would depend on whether society had learned anything from the terrible choices she had been forced to make.